And then he went to bed early, which isn't like him. He's the night owl. Lazarus is the night owl. Something wasn't right.
Sent for the only one who could help, who could fix it. He'd help total strangers, of course. More importantly, he was our friend. I promised Lazarus. Jesus would come. He would heal him. I was sure of it.
You know, you can see it sometimes in a person's eyes, that look. And they're letting go of this world just a little bit at a time.
Those 4 days might as well have been 4 lifetimes. Everything I knew about Jesus fell apart. Not that he wasn't the Messiah, it wasn't that. It was more personal.
There was all this pain, all this doubt. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. Our brother was dead, sealed in a tomb. And I said to him, if you had just been here, our brother wouldn't have died. But he said, didn't I tell you? If you would just believe, you would see God's glory.
I knew I was supposed to embrace those 4 days. That gap in my life, that gap in our lives, where God made no sense at all. It was as if God wasn't even listening. But without those 4 days, before I believed in him, now I believe him.
We didn't understand then, but we do now. He doesn't just give life.
He is life.
Yes.
He is the Christ. He is the Son of God who comes into this world, and whoever believes in him will live.
Start handing tissues out when you come in the door, right? Next week, for our Easter celebration, Hannah will be home for Easter, and there's one more of these, and we're going to do it live. So she's going to do the monologue. It's going to be Jairus' daughter. If you don't know that story, read it this week. It's in Mark chapter 5. Jairus' daughter. Be prepared. I think next week will be a really powerful story as we finish up this series called Believe. What you just saw starts out, the story behind Mary and Martha starts out in John chapter 11. Check it out, John chapter 11. And the story begins with this statement. Lazarus, this man named Lazarus, was sick. That's how it starts. The chapter starts with this simple statement, Lazarus was sick. But as the story begins to unfold, we find out that that was kind of like saying, Michael Phelps is a pretty good swimmer. Lazarus wasn't just sick. He didn't just have a bellyache or a migraine or a simple cold. He was dying. He was dying. This was not a small thing, a small blip in their lives. This was like stage 4, trip to the ER, call the family in. It was that size of a problem. And I wonder if you've ever been in John 11:1. I wonder if you've ever experienced that moment in your life where it just feels like I don't know how this is going to turn out, but it doesn't look good. I wonder how you dealt with that. I wonder how you handled that uncertainty. Maybe you did what Mary and Martha did. Maybe you cried out to Jesus for help. If you look at John chapter 11 with me, it starts out by telling us that Lazarus is sick, and it identifies where they live in Bethany, and he's living there with his sisters Mary and Martha. Same Mary that says later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair, if you're familiar with that story. Again, her brother Lazarus was sick. He's dying. In verse 3 says, so the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is very sick. If you have an NIV, it's translated, the one that you love is sick. So why reach out to Jesus in this moment? Well, because the situation is dire, because Lazarus is dying, and this situation is very clearly outside of their control. They know that Jesus is the only one who can fix this. They know that Jesus healed perfect strangers, people they didn't even know. And Jesus loved Lazarus. Surely he could provide a miracle for someone that he knows and that he cares about deeply. Jesus, we need you to come and fix this. I wonder if you've been there. I wonder if you can relate to that feeling in life when everything just seems like it's spinning out of control. I wonder how you handled that. Maybe you did what Mary and Martha did. Maybe you cried out to Jesus for help. Jesus, come and rescue us. Come and fix this. You're the only one who can. I've been in verse 1. I've prayed those desperate prayers. I can remember kneeling in a hospital chapel by myself and just begging God in a desperate prayer to take away the cancer out of my mom's body. I can remember holding my wife and praying together in a hospital room, begging God in desperate prayer that He would spare our daughter's life as her little body was crashing because of lack of oxygen. I've prayed those desperate prayers, and I know a lot of you have prayed those desperate prayers. Jesus, you're the only one who can fix this. We need your help. I find it interesting, I've noticed this in life, that it's not just believers who pray desperate prayers. I don't know if you've noticed this, but even sometimes people that aren't interested in God most of the time, people that don't have a relationship with Jesus, I've noticed that sometimes they will even pray a desperate prayer to God. And what that reveals is there's this level of belief in prayer. We know that a believer, it makes sense that someone who has got a relationship with Jesus, that has a belief in prayer, that makes sense. But even people that don't have, they have no interest in God most of the time, even they sometimes will pray out to God in desperation, hoping that He'll hear, hoping that He'll fix the problem. And it shows that there's this level of belief in prayer among a lot of people. Otherwise, why do it? Why pray if there's not some level of belief that it's going to make a difference? It's kind of like this. I'm told that essential oils can make a real difference in a person's body. My wife believes that. My wife believes that there are these oils that are they're going to help her with her hormone issues. And yes, I asked permission before I shared that with you. My sister believes in essential oils. She often will say to me, Mark, if you just take this oil and rub this oil or whatever, it'll help with your weird bowel problems that you have. Yeah, it just got personal. How about that? And I realize that there are essential oil evangelists probably in the room that are going through their essential oil Bible right now, and they're like, I'm going to find the essential oil that's going to fix your attitude problem, Pastor Mark, and I'm going to put it right in your eye. We're having a little bit of fun, but people that, let's say, don't think that essential oils are going to make any difference, they're not going to care what those who think it will make a difference say, or what books they can show them. They don't care. They're not going to have any interest in it, so they're not going to do it. There's a certain level of belief that prayer makes a difference, yes, among believers, of course, but even among those that don't give God a second thought most of the time, there's this certain level of belief that prayer will make a difference. The question that I want to ask you is this. Let's say that you pray. Maybe you're far from God. Maybe you're a strong believer. But let's say that you pray and you ask God to fix the problem in desperation. Lord, you're the only one who can make a difference. And I'm begging you, make a difference. Change this. Intervene. The question I want to ask you is this. Will you still believe if God doesn't do what you want? We're going to wrestle with that this morning. Will you still believe when God doesn't do what you want? We go back to the story of Lazarus. Yes, we know that he's sick. He's not just sick. He doesn't just have a headache. He's dying. And we know that Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus. Jesus, we need you. Lazarus needs you. You love Lazarus. We need you to come to the rescue and fix this. And we find out in the next verse, go to verse 4 and 5, we find out, yeah, Jesus does love this family. Verse 4 says, when Jesus heard about it, he said, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. Verse 5 is fascinating. So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. And I want you to notice that Jesus did not send a message back to Mary and Martha and Lazarus explaining why he wasn't coming. He knew why he wasn't coming. He knew what he intended to do through this experience, but he didn't share that with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And it leads us to this question that we have to wrestle with. Will you still believe if God doesn't tell you why he didn't do what you wanted him to do? Well, the worst does happen. We see this in verse 11. Verse 11 tells us, Jesus says to his disciples, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I'm going to go and wake him up. And the disciples don't get it right away. And they say in verse 12, well, Lord, if he's sleeping, he'll get better soon. Why? If he needs his rest, let's just let him rest. They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping. But no, that's not what Jesus meant. Verse 14, he tells them plainly, no, guys, Lazarus is dead. And for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him. Lazarus dies. The very worst thing that could happen happened. And so they go to Bethany to visit the family. In verse 17, look what it says in verse 17. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in the grave for 4 days. For 4 days. So Jesus finally shows up 4 days later, and there's a question that comes with this scene, like, okay, why did you come now? Why show up now? Did you come to offer your condolences? Did you come to offer comfort in our loss? That's not what we asked for. We sent word to you 4 or 5 days ago. We wanted you to come and fix this. Why are you here now? Have you ever needed help moving some heavy furniture, or maybe cleaning up a really big mess or some project, and you really could have used that extra hand? Nobody seemed to be around, and so you had to do it yourself. And by the end of it, you really struggled and your back hurts now and you're exhausted. And then finally, when it's all done, someone shows up. And you're like, well, that's perfect timing. I could have used your help 4 hours ago. How about something a little bit more serious? How about imagine that you or someone that you love needs emergency surgery. And instead, the surgeon says, sorry, no, I've got a tea time I can't miss, and goes golfing. But then he shows up at the funeral. The surgeon shows up at the funeral to offer condolences and sympathies. That's not what you wanted. You wanted the surgeon to show up and fix the problem. Not show up at the funeral and say sorry for your loss. And maybe you felt that way about God at different times in your life. Like you go through this really heartbreaking, tragic experience, and maybe someone shows up at the funeral home or maybe at church or in your home, and they do their best out of love and compassion to say something to you like, listen, God loves you. He cares about what you're going through right now. Jesus is here to comfort you in your time of pain. And maybe you don't say it out loud, but maybe there's something in the back of your mind that's like, well, that's nice. Why didn't he show up when I prayed and asked him to come and fix this? That's what I wanted. That's what I prayed for. That's how Mary and Martha felt. Yeah, I'm sure they were glad that Jesus was there to comfort them. But it's not what they prayed for. It's not what they asked Jesus to do. They wanted Jesus to come 4 or 5 days ago and fix this. Look at verse 20. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. She left the house. Mary stayed at the house. Martha went outside the village before Jesus even got into the village and met him out there. And this is what she said to him in verse 21. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. It wasn't, Lord, thank you so much for coming to offer your condolences. Thanks so much for coming and giving us a hug and a sorry for your loss. No, it's, Lord, if you would have just been here like we asked, this wouldn't have happened. And maybe you felt that way. If you look back over different seasons of your life, maybe you've prayed prayers like that. Lord, you are the only one that could have fixed this. You're the only one that could have changed this. And I've seen you answer prayer for other people. I know that you can. I thought you cared about me. I've served you for years. This person I was praying for, they love you. They're a strong believer. I don't understand why you didn't step in. If you would have just intervened, if you would have just stepped in and listened to my prayer and done what I asked you to do, this wouldn't have happened. And it forces us to wrestle with the question, will you still believe when God doesn't do what you want him to do? Did Martha? Let's find out. Look at verse 22. She says, Lord, in verse 21, if you'd only been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask for. She still believes. Verse 23, Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. Martha says, yes, he will. He will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. And Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this, Martha? And listen to her response. It's simply, yes, I still believe. She says, I've always believed you're the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world. And this exchange between Jesus and Martha is just fascinating. It's, I think, a really vivid picture of this point in our lives where we deal with the tension of what we really believe about Jesus. I love in verse 22 how she says to Jesus, after she says, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But then she says, but even now, I still believe that God will give you and do whatever you ask. She knew that Jesus can still perform miracles. And it's fascinating where Jesus responds by saying to her directly, your brother will rise again. But she doesn't interpret what Jesus said to her as, I'm going to go and bring your brother back to life. That's not how she interprets Jesus' statement. She took what he meant as to say, as a word of comfort. Yes, of course, I know that believers one day will rise from the dead when you come back at the resurrection. I know that that's true. I know that that's in the future. And I think it's really important to understand that we don't miss. Martha is saying, Lord, even though you didn't do what I wanted you to do, I still believe. I still believe you're the Christ. I still believe that you're good. I still believe that you are kind. Go back to the story in verse 28. She goes back to the house. She calls Mary aside from the mourners there at the house, and she said to Mary, the teacher, Jesus, is here, and he wants to see you. And so Mary immediately went to him. Verse 30, Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they just assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep, and so they followed her there. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet. And she said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. She says the exact same thing. It just makes you kind of wonder and imagine what the conversation was between Mary and Martha over the last several days, because they had the same conclusion. And when Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. You know, I've read this passage a number of times throughout the years, and I've often wondered what that means. Like, what were the emotions that Jesus was experiencing and that he felt in that moment? Because there's different thoughts on it from Bible scholars. You know, depending on the version that you have in front of you, you might have the phrase deeply troubled, moved in his spirit. What does that mean? What was he actually experiencing? And some Bible scholars think that he was upset or angry towards those who were questioning, like, he could heal blind people. Why didn't he come and fix this when they asked? There was maybe some Bible scholars think that maybe he was upset and angry just at Satan and sin and death, and this whole situation of sorrow and grief is because of sin and the brokenness that sin has created in the world. There's different thoughts. What I do know is this: we see that Jesus is not just fully God, he's fully human. He experiences this full range of emotions like you and I do when we're walking through sorrow and grief and these moments where other people are hurting. And he feels that sorrow. And he feels compassion. And he feels love for them. You go back here to this story. He's with Mary now, and he arrives, or Mary comes out and says, Lord, if you had only been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And this emotion wells up within Jesus, and he says, where have you put him? And they told him, Lord, come and see. And it says that Jesus wept. The people who were standing nearby said, see how much he loved him. Some said, this man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? And verse 38, Jesus, still angry, still has this strong emotion inside of him when he arrives at the tomb. Whatever that strong emotion was within Jesus, and whatever the degree of it, and all the different mixtures of what it would have been, here's what I know from this story. I know that Jesus did not reprimand them. for the way that they were questioning him. He didn't say, "How dare you question me?" It's not how he responded to them. He responded to them with love and compassion and with tears. And here's the thing. Jesus knew what he was about to do. He knew that he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead. Spoiler alert, if you've never read the story, that's where this is going. But even though he knew what he was about to do, he still felt the pain and the grief and the sorrow of the people he was standing with, the people that he cared about. And I spent a little extra time on that just to make the point that Jesus understands our pain. He wants to step into that grief with us. Jesus is not detached from emotion, even though he knows where this is all headed. Jesus knows that there's this resurrection of the believers that will take place one day when he comes back. And Jesus knows that on the other side of that, we get to experience, as believers, we get to experience eternity in a brand new heaven, a brand new earth with God forever. He knows that on the other side of this life is where believers get to experience a life that is free from pain and sickness and death and sorrow and tears. He knows that's where this is all going. And yet he still feels the weight of our sadness and our grief and wants to step into those spaces with us. And the question that we've got to answer is this: will you still believe that Jesus cares? Will you still believe that Jesus loves you even when God doesn't do what you want? Look what happens next. Look at verse 38. Jesus, still angry, still having the strong emotion as he arrives at the tomb, and there's this cave, and there's a stone that's been rolled across the entrance, and Jesus says, "Roll the stone aside," and Martha steps in and says, "Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible." And Jesus responded, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe?" Wait a minute, who's he talking to here? Because he's not talking to Mary and Martha. And that doesn't make any sense. He's talking to the disciples. Remember back in verse 4 when he says Lazarus' sickness will not end in death? No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. Verse 14, Lazarus is dead, and for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. He's talking to his disciples. Guys, I want you to see that I am in control. I want you, Jesus is talking to his disciples, I want you to believe that I am in control. And we see this happen in verse 41. The stone is rolled aside. Jesus looked up to heaven and he said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so that they will believe that you sent me." And then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and his feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." Jesus was in control the entire time. He wasn't caught off guard by this message that he got from Martha and from Mary about Lazarus. He was never in a panic. He was never uncertain about what he was going to do in the situation. No matter what's happening in our 4 days of pain and grief and misery and uncertainty that we experience, you and I can believe that Jesus is in control. We can be certain that he knows full well what he intends to do in our dark days. But I think that's the tension point in our faith. The tension point is this: you and I, we want to be in control. We want life to bend to our desires. We want other people to fall in line with what we want them to do. And we want God to do what we want him to do. Listen, Lord, I said the magic words in Jesus' name, so I'm pretty sure you have to do what I asked. And that's the tension point in our faith, when you and I realize that we're not in control. Maybe that's the whole point of these 4-day seasons of life that we experience. Maybe that's the point. To teach us that we're not in control. To teach us that God is in control. To help us answer the question, will I still believe when God doesn't do what I want? Will I still believe that God is good? Will I still believe that God is kind? Will I still believe that Jesus has an intentional plan in my pain? There's a lot of really great songs that people have written out of their pain as far as expressing their faith in God and what God's done in their lives through that pain. A lot of really great songs like that. One of my favorites is the song Blessings by Laura Story. And I didn't realize this until I went and looked up her story about that song. And it was written out of an experience, out of a time in her life when her husband was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And they, like anybody, they were praying for healing. And God wasn't answering their prayers the way that they wanted Him to. And so she was going through this season of life where she began to question, well, I believe in God's blessings, but it doesn't seem like God is blessing me. Maybe I don't really understand God's blessings. Do I still believe that God is blessing me even if He's not doing what I want? She began to see blessings in a different way, and she expressed it in that song. What if your blessings come through raindrops? What if your blessings come through tears? What if 1,000 sleepless nights is what it takes to know that you're near? What if the trials of this life are your mercies in disguise? What if the greatest disappointments, the aching of this life, is a revealing of a greater thirst that this world just can't satisfy? What if the trials of this life, the rain, the storms, the hardest nights, are your mercies in disguise? Will we still believe when God doesn't do what we want? Jesus asked that question a couple thousand years ago, and it still echoes into our world today. It still reverberates into our 4-day seasons of life. This question, do you believe? You know, you would think that after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, the answer to that question, like from everybody, would be, yeah, I absolutely believe. He just raised a guy from the dead. Look at the rest of the story. Verse 45. Many of the people who were with Mary believed in Jesus when they saw this happen. Notice it doesn't say all. It doesn't say everyone. It says many, which means some didn't. Verse 46, it says, some went to the Pharisees, told them what Jesus had done. The leading priests and the Pharisees called the high council together. What are we expecting? Guys, He just raised someone from the dead. We need to reevaluate this whole thing with Jesus. We're on the wrong side of it, right? You would expect that would be the conversation. Nope. They asked this, what are we going to do? This man certainly performs many miraculous signs. If we allow him to go on like this, soon everyone will believe in him. Time out. Is that a problem? Why don't they want to believe in him? I think the answer is in the rest of that verse. Then, if everyone believes in him, then the Roman army will come and destroy both our temple and our nation. You get this, right? You get what's going on? Jesus raised a dead man decomposing for 4 days in the grave, dead man, raises him back to life, and yet some don't believe. Why? Because they don't want to give up control. It's as simple as that. They don't want to give up control. Listen, if you want to be able to answer the question, will I still believe when God doesn't do what I want? If you want to be able to answer that question like Martha did, yes, I still believe, then you've got to be willing to give up your illusion of control. You've got to first believe that Jesus is in control of what's on the other side of this life. You must first believe that the reason that Jesus died on the cross was to sacrifice his own sinless, perfect life in exchange for our sin as a sacrificial payment to God. You must first believe that Jesus earned the powerful right to forgive sin on the cross. He proved it when he defeated death, when he defeated sin at the resurrection. We ask the question, do you believe this? If you believe this about Jesus, then you can believe that he is in total control. You and I are going to we're going to experience 4-day seasons of life. Until we get on the other side of this broken world, that's part of the deal. We're going to go through these 4-day seasons of life, and it's going to be hard, and it's going to be heartbreaking. And yeah, we can turn to one another for comfort and for love, and we should, and we can turn to God for comfort and encouragement and peace, and we should. But are we still going to believe that God is good, that God is kind, that God is really in control? Are we still going to believe when God doesn't do what we want? I'll leave you with this question. We think about this question, do you believe this? The challenge I'll leave you with, let go of your desire for control and find out. That's how you'll know if you believe it. Let go of your desire for control, and you'll find out what you believe.